The advertisement had used exactly 14 words. Miriam Voss counted them twice, standing under the post office awning in Halifax with sleet coming sideways off the harbor and her last coin still warm in her palm from the streetcar fare she hadn't spent. Rancher, widower, 3 children, British Columbia interior. Need capable woman, not looking for sentiment, that was all. No age given, no description of the land or the house, no reassurance that the man was decent or the children manageable or the winter survivable. Just 14 words and a postal address in a town called Enderley Crossing that wasn't on any map she'd been able to find. She had read it 4 times before folding it into her coat pocket. Then she had walked back to the boarding house on Barrington Street, where she owed 3 weeks of rent and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall for a long time. The wall had nothing useful to say. It never did. She wrote back the next morning, not because she was romantic about the West or had harbored any particular fantasy about ranching in the British Columbia interior. She wrote because she was 29 years old and had been surviving on seamstress piecework and the goodwill of a landlady who was running out of both patience and goodwill in equal measure. She wrote because her mother had died in October, and with her went the last person in Halifax, who would have noticed if Miriam disappeared entirely. She wrote because 14 words was an honest count, and a man who didn't waste words on advertisement was probably a man who didn't waste them on promises he couldn't keep either. His reply came in 11 days. It was shorter than the advertisement. Miss Voss. Train to Kamloops, then stage to Enderley Crossing. I'll arrange the rest. Arrival by 1st of March, if possible. Garrett Holt. She read it standing at the post office counter. The postal clerk was pretending not to watch. She put the letter in her pocket with the advertisement and went to sell the last of her mother's silver. The train west took 4 days. The stage from Kamloops took another 2, through country that grew bigger and stranger the further they went from anything she recognized. She pressed her face to the window and watched the mountains appear out of low cloud and didn't look away until they'd been traveling through them long enough that looking became ordinary, which it never quite did. Enderley Crossing was a collection of buildings arranged, without much conviction, around a main street that turned to mud the moment you stepped off the boardwalk. A general store, a feed merchant, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple that someone had stopped caring about somewhere between the first and second nail, and a hotel that called itself one without particularly earning the description. Perhaps 30 people visible in the street, and every single one of them paused what they were doing when the stage pulled in. She was used to being looked at. She was not used to being looked at with quite this combination of curiosity and preemptive pity, the particular expression of people watching something arrive that they have already privately decided will not last. A woman came out of the general store wiping her hands on her apron. Mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had made its peace with the climate decades ago, and no longer argued with it. She looked Miriam over with the frank efficiency of a woman assessing livestock at market. "You'll be the one Holt sent for," she said. It wasn't a question. "Miriam Voss." She kept her voice level. "May Sutherland. I run the store." She looked at Miriam's trunk, then at her shoes, then at her face in that order. "You're younger than I expected. What did you expect?" "Something more weathered." She said it without cruelty. "The Holt place is 6 miles east. Road's poor right now with the melt. I'll have my boy take you out." Miriam picked up her bag. "I can manage. I know you think you can." May Sutherland looked at her again. The second look more careful than the first. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth, but the faint beginning of reconsideration. "Get in the wagon. You'll want to arrive with your dignity, and that road will take it if you let it." The Holt Ranch came up over a rise in the late afternoon light, and Miriam's first honest thought was that it looked the way a man looks when he's been fighting a losing battle long enough to forget there was ever any other kind. The main house was solid enough. Good timber, 2 stories, a long covered porch, but it wore its age badly. One shutter hung at an angle. The kitchen garden beside the house was a tangle of dead stalks that nobody had cleared since autumn, maybe longer. The barn was large and well-built and visibly the most tended thing on the property. May Sutherland's boy was 14 and mostly silent. He dropped her at the gate and turned the wagon around before she'd reached for her trunk. She stood there a moment in the cooling air, listening to the wagon wheels fade. Then the front door opened. 3 children came out. Not in a rush, not with curiosity or noise. They came out carefully, the way children come out when they have learned that new arrivals usually mean disruption, and disruption has rarely meant improvement. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, with dark braided hair and her father's eyes. She had her father's eyes without ever having met him yet, but Miriam would understand this later. She stood with her arms folded across her chest and looked at Miriam with the expression of someone who has already made up her mind and is waiting for the evidence to confirm it. Behind her, a boy of perhaps 9, stocky, studying his boots, and at the very end, pressed against the doorframe, a girl of 5 or 6 with an unfortunate haircut and a smear of jam on her chin and enormous dark eyes that were watching Miriam with the particular attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide what they're feeling. None of them spoke. Miriam walked to the steps and set down her bag. "I'm Miriam Voss," she said. "I'm looking for Garrett Holt. He's in the barn." The oldest girl. Her voice was flat but not unkind, the flatness of someone working to keep it controlled. He said to wait. "What's your name?" A pause. The question seemed to cost her something small. "Sable, and your brother and sister?" She pointed without looking at them. "Miles and Rue." The youngest, Rue, had edged 3 inches forward from the doorframe without appearing to notice she'd done it. She was looking at Miriam's hair with the frank stare of someone encountering something genuinely interesting. "Your hair's like copper," she said. "It is," Miriam agreed. "Our mama had brown hair." She said it directly, the way small children say true things, without understanding what the landing will feel like. "Papa keeps her brush on the shelf in his room. He doesn't use it. He just keeps it." Miriam didn't say anything for a moment. There was no good answer to that. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's a hard thing for a family." Rue looked at her with enormous eyes. "Sable says you probably won't stay. Does she?" Rue glanced toward her sister, then back. "She says the last lady looked at the house and got back on the stage." "I've already set my trunk down," Miriam said. Rue looked at the trunk. She seemed to weigh this seriously. Then she came and sat on the porch step in front of Miriam without being invited, tucked her knees to her chest, and didn't say anything else. Which was, Miriam understood, its own kind of answer. Garrett Holt came out of the barn 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Deliberate footsteps across frozen mud, the sound of a man who moves through space like he's always got somewhere specific to be. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her on the porch, and for just a second something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Then it was gone. He was larger than she'd pictured. Not tall exactly, but built with the kind of density that comes from years of physical work and nothing else. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard that wanted trimming, hands that had been through more than hands should reasonably go through. Somewhere in his late 30s, though he wore it older, the way men do when they've been the only adult in a house for too long. He walked to the porch and looked up at her. "Miss Voss? Mr. Holt." He looked at her trunk, at Rue sitting on the step, at her face briefly, the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't solved yet. "You're smaller than I thought." She had not expected that to be the opening. "You're quieter than I expected," she replied. Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The place where one might be if smiling were still something he practiced regularly. "Supper's whatever the children put together," he said. "I didn't know exactly when you'd arrive. That's fine. Room's off the kitchen." "Small," he said it like a warning. "I didn't bring much." He nodded as though they'd agreed on something practical. "Wedding Saturday. Reverend Mackay comes through twice a month. We caught him." "Saturday's fine." He turned to go back to the barn. She called after him, "Mr. Holt." He stopped, turned. "It's good to meet you," she said. She meant it plainly, the way you mean something that is true without being large. He looked at her for a moment. "Likewise," he said, in the tone of a man who hasn't used the word in long enough that he's not entirely sure it still fits. Then he went back to the barn. Miriam sat down in the porch chair and let out a slow breath. Rue was watching her from the step. "He doesn't talk much," Rue said helpfully. "I noticed. Miles doesn't either," she considered. "I talk enough for both of them." "I believe you," Miriam said. The wedding happened on a Saturday that couldn't settle on weather and chose instead a kind of gray compromise. Not cold enough for snow, not warm enough for anything better, with a flat light over the yard that made everything look provisional. Reverend Mackay was a thin man with careful eyes who said the words in the Holt front room while the 3 children stood in a row with the expressions of people attending a proceeding they had not been consulted about. May Sutherland had appeared without being invited, which seemed to be a habit of hers, and stood near the back wall with her arms folded, and the expression of a woman overseeing an outcome she considers acceptable, if not ideal. Garrett stood beside her in a clean shirt with a pressed crease that was slightly uneven. She could see him holding himself with the specific stiffness of a man determined to endure something with dignity rather than experience it. She wore her blue traveling dress, the better of the 2 she'd brought, repaired at the collar the night before by lamplight in the small room off the kitchen while the house settled around her. Reverend Mackay said the words. She said hers. Garrett said his in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely without inflection. When it was done, May made a small sound of satisfaction. Rue clapped once. Then she looked at Sable to see if clapping was appropriate, and Sable's expression suggested it wasn't, and Rue stopped. Miles looked at the floor. Sable looked at the window. There was no cake. There was coffee and a tin of shortbread that May Sutherland had brought, and slices of the bread Miriam had baked at 5 that morning because she'd been awake anyway, and the kitchen was there and it seemed like something useful to do. After Mackay left and May followed, Garrett stood in the kitchen doorway while Miriam cleared the cups. "You didn't need to make bread," he said. "I was up." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe in the particular contained way he had, like a man who had taught himself to take up less space than he actually occupied. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Garrett," he said. "You'd better call me Garrett." "Garrett." She set down the cup. "I'm not a romantic. I'm not here because I had a dream about the interior or a particular feeling about ranching. I'm here because I needed to be somewhere, and this somewhere needed someone. I'll do right by your family. That's the only promise I can make, and I think it's worth something." He was quiet long enough that the fire settled in the stove. "It's worth something," he said. Then he went outside. She stood alone in the kitchen that was technically now hers, or at least the one she lived in, and felt the enormous complicated weight of that. Not grief, not joy, something that lived in the territory between them where most real things actually happen. She picked up the cup and finished washing it. By the end of the first week, she understood the scale of what she'd walked into. She had expected difficulty. The advertisement had said capable woman, not sentiment, and she'd read that clearly. But there's a difference between expecting hard and standing inside it. The pantry was the first problem that revealed itself slowly and then all at once. The first 3 days she cooked from what was there. By the 5th day she was rearranging shelves and running numbers in her head, and by the 6th she understood that what she'd taken for a modestly stocked larder was the result of someone. Sable, she'd learn, carefully arranging things to appear more plentiful than they were. The flour was 3 weeks gone. The salt pork was insufficient for a winter that still had months left in it. The potatoes in the root cellar were there but not enough, and a third of them had gone soft. She said nothing to Garrett yet. She sat at the kitchen table the 5th night with her notebook and a stub of pencil and made an inventory by lamplight while the house slept. And then she sat with the inventory and thought about it. The ranch itself told a story she could read without anyone narrating it. The barn was well built, clearly the center of Garrett's attention. The pasture fencing had once been well maintained, but the equipment showed the kind of neglect that comes not from laziness, but from too much else requiring attention and not enough hands. Garrett rose before light and was in the barn by 5. He came in for meals, said little, went back out. He moved through supper like a man completing a required function and went upstairs directly after. She had not seen him stop. The children operated on the same rhythm at smaller scales. Sable ran the household with a competence that was quietly heartbreaking. 12 years old and managing a kitchen and 3 people's schedules, setting aside the 12-year-old parts of herself entirely. Miles handled morning and evening chores without complaint or conversation. And Rue, who was 6, appeared at intervals throughout Miriam's days to make reports. A magpie on the fence post, a crack she'd found in the smokehouse wall, a question about whether Miriam knew how to make the kind of oatcakes her mother used to make with a little bit of molasses in them. "I don't know which kind your mother made," Miriam said, "but tell me how you remember them." Rue described them with the vocabulary of a 6-year-old who has very strong opinions and very few culinary words. Miriam wrote down what she could interpret and tried it that evening. It wasn't right, she knew it. But when she set them on the table, Rue went very quiet in the way children go quiet when something has surprised them past the capacity for words. She didn't say anything, but she ate too, and then she came and stood near Miriam at the stove for a while, not saying anything, just near. Miriam kept her eyes on what she was doing. Sable watched from across the room with an expression that was not warmth, but was at least the beginning of something that might become it, given enough time and enough evidence. The first real confrontation happened 10 days in, when Miriam went to take stock of the supply shed behind the barn and found it padlocked. She went to find Sable, who was in the yard splitting kindling with a hatchet she handled like someone who'd been using it since she was 9, which she probably had. "The supply shed's locked," Miriam said. "It's always locked." She didn't look up. "Who has the key?" A pause that was slightly too long. "My father. I'm trying to get a full account of the stores. I need to know what we're working with before the next freeze." Sable looked up. Her eyes were dark and direct. "My father manages the accounts. I've been asked to manage the household. That's not the same thing." She held Sable's gaze. The girl was 12 and had been the most capable person in this house for what Miriam estimated was close to 2 years. She was not going to fight her for territory. "You know this place better than anyone," Miriam said. "I'm not trying to step on your work, Sable. I'm asking you to sit down with me and go over what we have, because you already know, and I need to catch up." Something shifted. Whatever Sable had prepared for, it wasn't that. Come on then, she said. They sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, and Sable went through everything with the precise efficiency of someone who had been tracking these numbers in her head for months out of necessity. She was, Miriam realized, correct on almost every figure: flour, salt pork, oil, firewood, feed. She knew all of it. You're short on nearly everything for a full winter, Miriam said when they'd finished. I know. What was the plan? Sable set her pencil down. Something pressed at the surface of her careful composure. Papa was going to sell 2 cows before freeze. Fill the gap. She paused. He hasn't. What's stopping him? A long silence. Sable looked at the table. He thinks selling is losing. Every head he lets go is one less he's built. He'd rather find another way. Has he found one? Sable didn't answer. I'll talk to him, Miriam said. Sable's head came up sharply. He won't like it. I know. Miriam closed the notebook. But I'm not here to be quiet about things that matter. She found Garrett at the far pasture fence, resetting a post that the spring thaw had heaved. He was driving it with a maul, steady and hard, the work of a man who needs something to hit. We're short on provisions, she said. He didn't stop. I'm handling it. Sable says you were going to sell 2 cows before freeze. He stopped. The maul hung in his hands. Sable talks too much. Sable's been carrying this house on her back for 2 years. She talks to me because I asked directly, and she didn't see a way around it. Miriam kept her voice even. When are you selling the cattle? When I decide to. The root seller's going soft. Miles is wearing boots with a hole in the left one. And Rue? She paused. Rue is 6 and underweight, and she's been stretching the oatmeal by putting less in her own bowl than the others. I don't think she knows I've noticed. Something moved through his face. He turned back to the post. 2 cows, he said. I'll arrange it by Thursday. She stood there a moment. Thank you. She walked back toward the house. She didn't look back. But behind her, she heard the maul strike once more, with a different quality. Not fury, just completion. The difference between a man hitting something and a man finishing a task. In her experience, the distinction was where everything important lived. She found the cookbook 2 weeks in, tucked behind the cast iron pot that hadn't been moved in long enough to leave a ring on the shelf. It was handmade, really, a small cloth-covered notebook, the pages filled with careful handwriting in blue ink. Recipes and occasional notes, the kind of notes people write when they're cooking for someone they love. Miles won't eat rosemary. Try thyme instead. Rue prefers her porridge sweet. Garrett takes his coffee, the same as his father did. She sat with it a long time at the kitchen table. She recognized the handwriting from the Christmas labels, still on the mason jars in the cellar. Garrett's wife, the children's mother. A woman she would never meet who had left this house full of evidence of herself. Careful, considered evidence. The kind that said, I was paying attention. I knew these people. I was here. She made the oatcakes from the recipe on page 4 the next morning. The real ones with the molasses and the pinch of salt the recipe specified. When Rue came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway and looked at the pan, she was very still. Those are the right ones, she said. Her voice was very small. Sit down and eat them while they're warm. Rue sat. She ate too. She didn't cry, but it was a close thing. She was 6 and working hard to hold it together, and Miriam could see the effort in the set of her small jaw. After breakfast, Rue came and pressed her forehead briefly against Miriam's arm, the wordless way children do when they have run out of language for a feeling. Miriam kept her eyes on the pot. She put one hand on the back of Rue's head for a moment. That was all. Garrett had seen it from the doorway. She didn't acknowledge him. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she heard him pour his coffee and sit down. The town's opinion of her arrived when she went into Enderley Crossing for flour. She found 2 women from neighboring ranches already at the counter who paused their conversation with the particular pause of people who have just been discussing the person who has just walked in. They were introduced to her as Patricia Aldridge and Frances Vane. Patricia was pleasant in the determined way of someone who has decided pleasantness is a discipline and practices it whether or not it's reciprocated. Frances was older and sharper, with the careful smile of a woman who trades in social currency and knows exactly what everything is worth. We've been wondering about you, Frances said, in a tone that made wondering sound like a verdict. Garrett Holt wasn't easy before he lost Margaret, she added, with a delicate headshake that was meant to imply volumes. After, she let it trail. Most people become difficult given enough hardship, Miriam said pleasantly. Frances's eyes sharpened. She wasn't used to being redirected. Sable must be a handful, Patricia offered more kindly. She's a capable girl, Miriam said, with a firmness that closed the inquiry. May Sutherland, behind the counter, was watching all of this with the expression of someone who is finding it faintly entertaining. She set the flour on the counter. That'll be 60 cents. Miriam paid and gathered her things. At the door she paused. The Holt family is doing fine, she said. They're working on it. That's all any of us can say. She left before anyone could respond. Out on the street with the flower under her arm and the late winter wind finding the gap at her collar, she felt the town watching her in the particular way a town watches something it has decided is probably temporary. She had felt this before. In Halifax, after her mother died, the city had watched her with the same waiting quality. The audience that has bought a ticket to something falling apart and doesn't want to leave before it does. She had not given Halifax the performance. She had no intention of giving Enderley Crossing one either. She lifted her chin against the wind and walked to the wagon. The real explosion happened on a Wednesday evening near the end of March, and it began, as most important things in that house began, with something that seemed unrelated to what it was actually about. Miles had left the barn door unlatched in the cold, and one of the horses had gotten out and damaged itself on the fence line, and Garrett had found it in the early dark and come in for supper, carrying that particular controlled quiet of a man containing something too large for the room. Miriam had kept the conversation moving through supper in the small ways she'd learned. Asking Rue about the bird she'd been watching from the upstairs window, asking Miles about the arithmetic he'd been working on. She was aware of Garrett at the head of the table saying nothing in a way that had more pressure in it than silence usually carried. It was Sable who said something. She had been watching her father for most of the meal with the expression of someone reading weather. "I told Miles to check that latch yesterday," she said, not unkindly, just stating the fact. "Sable," Garrett said. His voice was even. "Too even? I'm just saying, I know what you're saying." "Then you know Miles should have. That's enough." Sable's jaw set. She was 12 and had been running this household and absorbing this silencing for 2 years, and something in her had decided tonight that enough had met its limit. That's what you always say. That's enough. Everything just stops before it actually gets said. Before anything gets said, and we all sit there being. She stopped herself, but the word had already started coming, and she couldn't quite recall it. "We're not fine, Papa. We haven't been fine since." She stopped. The name didn't come out, but it was in the room anyway. It had always been in the room. Miles had gone white. Rue had set down her spoon and was watching her sister with huge, careful eyes. Garrett pushed back from the table and stood up and walked out, not slamming the door. The opposite, a careful, controlled close, which was somehow much worse. The children sat. Nobody moved. Then Miles said very quietly to his plate, "Well, is Papa coming back?" Rue asked. "Yes," Miriam said. "He's coming back. Eat your supper." She gave it half an hour. Then she put on her coat and went to the barn. Garrett was sitting on a hay bale at the far end, elbows on his knees, looking at the packed dirt between his boots. The lantern made long shadows. Outside, the wind was working at the barn walls and finding places where the timber had gaps. She sat down 3 feet away and didn't say anything for a moment. "You knew," he said. Not accusing, just the fact. "That Sable's been managing everything since the first week, and you didn't tell me. I wanted to understand it first. I wanted to know how you'd hear it." He made a sound that wasn't a laugh. "And did I?" "Not yet," she said. "But you walked out instead of saying something you couldn't take back. That's something." He was quiet. Up close, he had the look of a man who had just had a door open to a room he'd been keeping shut and wasn't sure whether that was relief or disaster. "Probably both. I built this place from nothing," he said finally. "My father left me 40 acres and a lean-to and said figure it out. I did. I added 120 acres over 12 years. We ran 200 head at peak." He stopped. Margaret dying, the name came out differently than everything else. Softer and older, with a roughness at the edges that all the careful management in the world couldn't smooth. There were months I don't remember clearly. I was upright and functioning because they needed someone upright and functioning. Everything else. He shook his head. Everything else went sideways, and I kept telling myself I'd get back to it. "But you couldn't ask for help," Miriam said. "Not criticism. Just naming it. Holtz don't." He caught himself, almost smiled at that, without humor. "My father used to say that, like it was something to be proud of, and now you find out your 12-year-old has been running the house and rationing the flour." He looked at his hands. Sable's. His throat worked. "Sable should be worrying about whatever 12-year-olds worry about, not the flour." "No," Miriam said. "She shouldn't, and Miles has been." He stopped. "Miles has been very quiet for a long time," she said. "And Rue doesn't know why the house feels the way it does, but she knows it feels that way. And she puts less oatmeal in her own bowl so the others have more, and she's 6 years old." The silence after that had a different weight. "I don't know how to fix it," he said. It cost him something visible. The words came out with the particular rawness of a man saying a true thing he's been preventing himself from saying. "I know what needs doing on this land. I know cattle and fence lines and where the water table runs. I don't know how to." He stopped. "I don't know how to go back in there and make it right." "You don't have to make it right tonight," she said. "You just have to go back in there and say something true." He looked at her. What if I don't know what's true anymore? Start with what you're certain of, she said. You love them. That's certain. Start there. She left him in the barn. She stood on the porch for a few minutes in the cold, looking at the dark and the stars coming out between clouds, and gave the house its privacy. Through the kitchen window she could see the lamplight and the shapes moving in it. Garrett coming back through the door, the children at the table, and then the stillness of a room where something is being said that has not been said before. She could tell by the way Sable's shoulders came down, just a fraction of an inch, that it was real. She could tell by the way Miles looked up from his plate and kept looking up. And she could tell by the way Rue climbed off her chair and went to her father, the direct, simple movement of a 6-year-old who has decided the distance is no longer necessary. Miriam went inside after a while. Nobody said anything about the gap she'd given them, but the room had changed. Not dramatically. More the way air changes when a window you didn't realize was painted shut finally gives a little, and you understand the room had been closer than you'd let yourself notice. Garrett looked at her across the kitchen when she came in. Just briefly. She gave him a small nod and went to the stove. Nothing was resolved. Nothing as real as this resolves in one evening. Old grief doesn't close. It has to be cleaned first. And cleaning always hurts and always leaves marks. She knew this. She suspected he was beginning to know it. But Sable, washing the cups at the basin, was moving differently. And Miles had stayed at the table instead of disappearing the moment supper ended, and was sitting with a piece of paper doing something careful with a pencil, staying. Miriam poured coffee and sat down and let the evening find its own level. April came in cold, and then slowly, reluctantly, less cold. The snow that had held the valley all winter began to give way in patches. South-facing slopes first, then the yard, then finally the north field where the drifts had been deepest. Miriam stood in the kitchen garden the first real warm morning and looked at what was salvageable and what wasn't, and made her list. The ranch was finding a rhythm, not a comfortable one. Comfort was not a word that applied to this land or these people in any simple way, but a real one. A rhythm that included, for the first time since she'd arrived, actual conversation during the work. Garrett had begun asking the children direct questions at meals, small ones, specific ones. What Rue had seen from the upstairs window. What Miles thought about the north fence situation. What Sable thought should be done about the chicken coop. He was not practiced at it. The questions came out stiff sometimes and landed awkwardly, but they came. One evening in the second week of April, Miriam was at the kitchen table with her account notebook when Garrett came in from the last barn check and instead of going upstairs, sat down across from her. She looked up. There's a man named Douglas Farr who runs the operation about 4 miles south, he said without preamble. He's been having fence trouble all spring. I was thinking I'd ride out tomorrow and help him work it. She looked at him steadily. That's a good idea. I haven't. He stopped, started again. I've let things go with the neighbors. After Margaret, people would come, bringing things, wanting to know how we were managing, and it felt, he searched for the word, it felt like being watched, like everyone waiting to see whether we'd make it. They probably were, Miriam said. That doesn't mean they wanted you to fail. He was quiet. She could see him measuring something, some wall he'd built that had made sense at the time and was now costing more than it was worth. Take Sable, she said. He looked at her. She should be learning the neighbors, Miriam said. This will be her land someday, or part of her decision about it. She should know who Douglas Farr is. A long pause. You think she wants that? I think she's wanted nothing else since she was 8, and I think you already know that. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the edge of her notebook without reading it, then pushed back from the table. At the doorway he stopped. I'll ask her, he said. She heard him at Sable's door upstairs. The low exchange of voices, and then the door opening wider, and then both voices working through logistics. The particular sound of a conversation between a man and his daughter that was happening on 2 levels, at once the practical and the other thing, underneath it. Miriam put out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Through the thin wall of the room off the kitchen, she could still faintly hear them talking. It was the first night since she'd arrived that she'd heard Garrett stay up past 9. What happened to the Holt place after that was not dramatic and did not announce itself. It accumulated the way real change always accumulates. In small decisions made consistently, in the slow erosion of habits that have become more burden than protection. Sable stopped managing everything from a careful distance and began occasionally to simply be in the kitchen while Miriam cooked, not helping necessarily, just present. She would sit at the table with a book or a piece of mending and say things sometimes. Observations about the weather, opinions about the fence situation, a question about a recipe that she pretended was idle curiosity, and that Miriam received as the genuine thing it was. Miles built something in the barn over 2 weeks that he didn't explain to anyone. He came in from it each evening looking satisfied in a particular private way. Miriam did not ask. When it turned out to be a shelf he'd made for Rue to keep her collection of interesting rocks on, because she'd been keeping them in a pile by her bed, and he'd decided this was disorganized. She found out from Rue, who told her with the enthusiasm of someone who has received something they didn't know they needed. Rue had begun, somewhere in March, to occupy more space in the house. Not badly, she was 6 and had always been herself with complete commitment, but differently, less carefully. She talked more. She argued with Miles about things of no consequence with the vigor of a child who has been given permission to take up room. One morning she came to breakfast with her hair in a complicated arrangement of her own devising, involving 2 mismatched ribbons and a section that was almost certainly going to require scissors before the day was out, and she sat down with the total dignity of someone who is entirely confident in their choices. "That's a very specific look," Miriam said. "I did it myself," Rue said. "I can tell. Do you like it?" Miriam considered honestly. "I think it shows ambition." Rue seemed satisfied with that. Garrett was not easy. She had known he wouldn't be. He was better in the sense that matters. More present, more deliberate, trying in the ways that counted. But he was still more silence than speech. Still retreated sometimes to places she couldn't follow. Still carried the particular grief of a man who loved someone specific and lost her, and hasn't finished losing her and probably won't entirely. She did not expect that to change. She stopped wanting it to, somewhere in March when she understood it was part of who he was, and that grief kept faithfully was not the same as grief unmanaged. One evening in late April, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she was at the kitchen table when Garrett came in and sat down across from her. He sat with his hands around his cup for a while, not speaking. "I want to say something," he said finally. She waited. "I put 14 words in that advertisement because I didn't want to make promises I couldn't be sure of." He looked at the table, not looking for sentiment. "I wrote that to protect myself, because the last time He stopped, because I'd had something and lost it, and I'd decided that the careful thing was to be clear about what I was offering." "I understood that," she said. "I know you did." He looked up. "The thing is," he stopped again with the expression of a man who is saying something he has not rehearsed and is aware he's going to do it badly and is going ahead anyway. "The thing is, this has not been, what I put in that advertisement." Miriam looked at him. "What I mean," he said, "is that I have," he pressed his hands together, "I have come to regard you considerably." The words came out in the careful, stripped-down way of a man who has decided that what he's feeling deserves honesty, even if honesty is the harder option. "I don't know how to say it better than that. I wasn't planning on this. But here it is." The kitchen was very still. Outside, the late April wind was quiet for once. Somewhere upstairs, the house settled. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I've been waiting to see if you'd say it." He almost laughed. The almost law she'd been watching him suppress since February, the one that was right there and never quite arrived. This time it made it, briefly, real, a little rusty, belonging to who everything had required him to be careful. "And?" he said. "And I've been here since March," she said. "I think that's an answer." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen held them both, and then he reached across the table, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, and covered her hand with his, briefly, the way a man does a thing he's not yet fully fluent in, but intends to learn. "All right," he said. Spring came properly in May, the way the valley had clearly been working toward since the first thaw. The kitchen garden was planted in full, not the rescued remnants she'd worked with in March, but a real planting, with rows of vegetables that actually stood a chance, and the herb section she'd been planning since she'd found the cloth cookbook and seen what had grown there before. Sable helped her plant it on a Saturday afternoon, crouching in the turned earth with her sleeves rolled up, asking questions about which seeds went how deep with the concentrated attention of someone filing information for later use. She would run this garden herself, Miriam thought, probably sooner than either of them would expect. Miles had begun talking. Not extensively, not suddenly. He was 9, and had been quieter than 9 for long enough that it had become structural. But he offered things. An observation about the horse's temperament in wet weather. A question about whether Miriam had always lived in cities. A comment at dinner one evening, directed at his father about the way the light was sitting on the north field in the evening. Just, "That's a good light, isn't it?" Garrett had looked up from his plate and looked out the window and said, "Yes, it is," and Miles had gone back to eating, and nobody made anything of it, which was the right call. Rue had made a friend. The daughter of a neighboring family named the Brecks, 7 years old and similarly definite in her opinions, had come with her parents to a supper at the Holt place in April. and she and Rue had reached an immediate understanding that had resulted in a sustained correspondence via notes that Rue's increasingly competent handwriting was just barely adequate to carry. Miriam sometimes proofread them. The content was urgent and detailed, and primarily about birds. On the first Friday in May, Garrett made supper. This was sufficiently unusual that it gathered all three children in the kitchen on various pretexts. Miles checking something, Sable needing something from a shelf, Rue simply sitting at the table with her arms folded like someone who has a front row seat and intends to use it. What Garrett made was a stew that had been going since the afternoon, with the bread Miriam had baked that morning, and it was in fact good. Better than expected. He set it on the table and sat down and looked around at his family. All three children, Miriam at the other end. The kitchen warm with the stove going and the long spring evening coming through the window. "I want to say something," he said. Miles looked up. Sable put down her spoon. Rue went very still, with the focused attention of someone who does not intend to miss a word. "I've done things badly," he said, in the direct, no-ceremony way that was his most honest form. "After your mother died, I handled the ranch. I handled the work. I did not handle the rest of it, and all of you know that better than I'd like. Sable," he looked at her, "you've been running this house since you were 10. That is not a thing I should have let happen. I see it. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that plainly." Sable looked at the table. Her jaw was tight in the way that means someone is working very hard to hold something still. "Miles," Garrett looked at his son. "You've been quieter than any 9-year-old should have to be. I've been part of that. That's going to change." Miles said nothing, but he met his father's eyes, which was its own statement. And Rue. His voice changed, just slightly. "You've been putting less porridge in your bowl than your brother and sister every morning for 6 months, and you've never said a word about it. I should have seen that a long time ago." A pause. "I see it now." Rue looked at him with enormous dark eyes. "I was just doing the math," she said. "I know," he said. "You shouldn't have had to." She seemed to consider this. Then, "Are you going to do better?" "Yes," he said, not with any decoration. Just the word. Rue nodded as though this was satisfactory and picked up her spoon. Sable made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely, and looked very hard at the window for a moment. Miles was doing something careful with his bread that didn't require looking at anyone. Miriam stayed at her end of the table and let it be what it was. Then Garrett looked at her. "I should say something to you as well," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I do." He held her gaze with the particular steadiness that was his most honest expression, unguarded, just present, without the management he usually kept over himself. "You came here in March with 14 words worth of information about what you were walking into. You stayed. You pushed on things that needed pushing, and you left alone the things that needed room. And you got more of that right than I had any reason to expect." He paused. "I'm glad you wrote back." The kitchen was quiet. The stew settled in its pot. The evening light lay long across the floor. Miriam looked at the man at the end of the table. Not easy, never going to be easy, carrying things he'd always carry. And at the three children between them, and felt the strange, solid, imperfect weight of what had been built in this house over the course of one difficult winter and one early spring. "So am I," she said. Rue knocked over her milk glass. This happened regularly and showed no signs of improvement. The moment broke into the familiar small chaos of someone mopping up a spill while someone else complained about their sleeve, and Miles said something dry that made Sable actually laugh, and the kitchen was loud and warm and real. Outside, the May evening moved over the valley. The mountains that had been white since October were showing rock now, the snowline pulling back to the heights where it belonged. The fields were green, and the cattle were healthy, and the fence line that had been Garrett's quiet worry all winter was standing straight. Miriam stood at the kitchen window, after the supper things were cleared, looking out at the light on the mountains. Behind her, Rue was explaining something about a specific bird to anyone who would listen. Miles was listening with more patience than his expression suggested. Garrett had said something to Sable. She could tell by the tone of it that was practical and specific, and also not only practical and specific. The way conversations between fathers and daughters who are beginning to learn each other are never only what they appear to be. She thought about Halifax and the boarding house and the room with nothing on the walls. She thought about the advertisement with 14 words, and the letter with 11, and the train that had carried her west through mountains she'd never imagined, and the wagon road through the mud, and the gate where she'd stood with her trunk and looked at this house and thought, "This looks exhausted." It still looked complicated. It still asked more than was comfortable on a regular basis. The winters here were serious things and would continue to be. But the kitchen light was on, and the voices behind her were the voices of people who had decided. Not easily, not once, but repeatedly and in small ways, which is the only way it actually happens. to be a family. She had not come here for this. She had not known to want it. She had come with a worn trunk and a practical letter, and the honest acknowledgement that staying in Halifax meant disappearing, and that leaving at least meant something. She had not expected it to mean this much. She turned back to the kitchen, to the noise and the spilled milk and the argument about the bird and the man at the table, who caught her eye as she came back and held it for just a moment. Briefly, the way you hold something you've decided to keep. And she sat down, and the evening went on, and outside the valley lay in the long spring light, and it was, in all the ways that mattered, home.